The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Senators, Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I am pleased to say that all but Chad Rubin is here. Chad is on the DL. Ronnie Rabinovitz. Congratulations, Ronnie, on a great season for your Dodgers.
Thank you. Thank you.
And your Twins. 2 playoff teams, that's not bad. George Case III is here, son of George Case, former Washington outfielder supreme. How are you, George?
Always enjoy talking to everybody. Thank you.
Good.
Hi, George.
Glad, because that's what this is about. Bunch of kids get together, kids in old man's bodies get together and talk about how it was when we were kids.
Well, I thought Ronnie was going to guarantee a Dodgers victory, but I guess it didn't happen.
Well, I tried.
Hey,
it was a good series.
7 games, they did great. You know, they had a heck of a season, so, you know.
Yeah, that 7th game, they weren't so good.
A lot to build
No,
on.
that was the letdown of the series.
Yeah, I really thought after they won Game 6 that they were going to come back and take it with Game 7, but you know.
I did too.
I thought so too. They just fell asleep in Game 7.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I will third that. I really thought momentum. It reminded me of the '73 World Series when the A's beat the Mets in the 6th game, which I attended out in California, and then easily beat them in the 7th. It was, and I thought that's the way it was going to go.
Yep.
Sorry, Ronnie.
That's all right. Wait till next year.
Yeah, that's right, Ronnie. That's what I told you. That's the old Brooklyn Dodgers saying. Wait till next year.
I know.
That's right.
That's
right.
right. We've been waiting for 30 years now.
Hey, Ronnie,
I have an interesting premise before we get into the Cuban connection with the old Senators. I want to talk about fandom with you guys for a second. Let's start with David Hubler. David, before you became a Senators fan, and I'll bet you eventually did, you were a Yankee fan. Are you still, if it came down to it, would you root for the Yankees or the Senators/Twins?
Oh, absolutely the Yankees. That's my team. Live and die. That's my
team. Your team, David?
Oh, yeah.
Your team?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I talk about fandom. I'll give Ronnie probably doesn't know this story, but he does know Richard Zamoff, and his twin brother, who are probably 2 of the top 10 Dodgers fans of all time. And Ronnie, I know you know. Well, they grew up in my apartment building in the Bronx, and they were the only Dodgers fans for miles around. We had a few leftover Giants fans, but it was Yankees, mostly Yankees, and occasional the Dodgers. But they were the only ones in our building. But I distinctly remember a number of years. It all blends into one now. But when their mother, who was also a great Dodgers fan, after the Dodgers would lose to the Yankees, she came out on the stoop of the building. We all know what a stoop is, and she had a sign: "Wait till next year." And she did this, I guess, except for the 55 season, she did it every year that the Dodgers were in it.
That's so funny.
And it sounded like she'd made a bet with someone and lost, but she was a dyed-in-the-wool Dodgers fan. And of course, Richard and Barry, the 2 twins, they actually made it onto Happy Felton's Knothole gang, and they still have the letter inviting them on. I've seen the letter. Yeah, I've seen the letter signed by Happy.
Them in a couple of weeks. I'm going to be in Washington the end of the month. I'm speaking at Richard's classes. So.
That's the one in Bethesda, right?
No, in Washington at George Washington University.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll be there the 28th, 29th, and 30th.
Oh, well, let me see if I can make it over there. 28th.
Yeah. The 29th is the day I'm speaking.
That's Wednesday.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
possibly make that. I'll keep that in mind.
I'd love to have you be there.
Yeah, I'd like to meet you in person.
It'd be great. I'd love to meet you, too.
Okay.
Yeah. Be fun.
All right.
A lifetime Yankees fan and a lifetime Dodgers fan getting together.
That's
How's
right.
that?
That's right.
How
Is
cool.
Chad here by chance?
What's that?
What's that?
I thought Chad might come on today. I don't know if
I am on.
Oh, Chad.
Hey.
Welcome back. You've been on the DL, and Ronnie tells me you're recovering, and I hope you've been getting the best wishes from me and the station.
Oh, thank you very much.
Good. Let me not break my stride here because I could only think of one thing at a time. But I wanted to ask George what it was like. Obviously, you were a Senators fan when your dad played for them, and you were very small growing up.
Right.
What was it like when he was traded? How did your allegiance go?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was only 6 years old at the time, so I'm not sure I remember, but I do know that my dad, was there with Cleveland in 1 year, but he was happy to get back to Washington the next year. So my allegiance was always to Washington, and then, of course, with the Twins. But, being that my dad played in the American League, after he retired, I would, always follow Washington, and then he was in the Yankees organization at Oneonta when he managed, and my loyalty was always as a fan, and I always enjoyed baseball, but my loyalty was to American League because that's the league that my father played in.
Sure.
Appreciate that. So you don't have any memory of getting a new cap or a new shirt?
No, I don't remember doing that. I do remember going to ball games at Cleveland Stadium, but I think my dad's heart, and I think my, recollection of the time was that, he played in Cleveland. He enjoyed that 1 year, but he was definitely happy to get back to Washington. And then from that point on, as I got older, I really followed the Senators because I knew a lot of the players personally. Mickey Vernon was a longtime family friend. So, and Sid Hudson. And then when my dad got back into baseball in '61 with the expansion team, he and Mickey and Sid were just thrilled to be back together again. And my loyalty was again to the Washington Ball Club because I knew everybody, and that's what it was. So I always
probably knew you as a kid, right, George?
Yeah, that's the thing. For me, a little bit different than a lot of people. I was the son of a ball player, so I was in the clubhouses and I knew the players. They were family friends. I used to call Mickey Vernon Uncle Mickey. He'd come to our house and put me on his lap and sing me songs. He wasn't Mickey Vernon the ball player. He was my Uncle Mickey.
Hey, I hope we can do a show on him really soon, and I hope that you can invite some of his sons and or daughters.
Well, the one fellow that I would recommend, if you want to do that, I'd have to contact him, but a fellow named Rich Westcott, who's a writer, and Rich wrote a book called Mickey Vernon, the Gentleman First Baseman, and I helped him with a lot of information about Mickey. And, if you wanted, I can try to get a hold of Rich and see if he'd be available. I have no idea what his schedule is.
I have a lot to learn about Mickey Vernon.
Right.
When I was a kid, I would confuse he and Vic Wertz. I don't know if you guys put those two players.
I remember Vic Wertz.
Well, Dick Wertz was a very powerful, strong guy. Yeah, and
as was Mickey Vernon.
Right, Mickey was a line drive hitter, and I said many times, he was playing in Washington, and a lot of his league-leading double. I think he led the American League in doubles like 3 or 4 years. But if he had played at Yankee Stadium, a lot of those would have been home runs because Yankee Stadium had that short right field porch, and a line drive hitter, he'd put him into the stands.
Sure.
Okay. Before we get to Chad Rubin about fans, I've had a question in the back of my mind to ask Ronnie Rabinovitz for 2.5 years. You ready, Ronnie?
Yes. Yes.
That's a long time.
It's a long time.
For me, it's a long time. In dog years, it's not. But here we go. Ronnie, before Jackie came into your life, do you have memories of rooting for the Braves?
Not really. Because my dad was already a Dodger fan well before I was born. And he loved the Dodgers because, they signed Jackie. And so he always talked about the Dodgers. I mean, I did, and remember, the Braves didn't come into Milwaukee until 1953.
Right.
And that's the year I met Jackie.
Oh, wow.
So automatically I was a Dodger fan.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
One other question, and then we'll go to Chad. Was there anybody else on the Dodgers that maybe Jackie introduced you to, or for one reason or another you followed and rooted for back in the day?
Yes, of course, there were many. He introduced me to a lot of the players. He took me in the locker room and took a ball and had everybody signing the ball. Duke Snyder, Pee Wee Reese, Roy Campanella, Carl Frillo, Sandy Koufax, Gil Hodges. Sandy Koufax was a rookie that year. So I used to hang around the lobby at the Schrader Hotel in Milwaukee because that's where we'd always stay when the Dodgers were in town. And during the day, if it was a night game, we would go kibitz with the guys. I mean, I had a lot of fun with Jake Pittler. He was a coach. And Pete Reiser was a character. Was he a character? Oh, my God. Was he funny? Yeah, they were such great guys. And I hung around with all of them, with Campy and Gil and all of them in the lobby, but always with Jackie mainly. But it was really something. And then in 1960, which was very funny, my dad ran for the national committee man at the Democratic National Convention, which happened to be at the same time that the Dodgers were in town. So the Dodgers were wearing "I'm for Dave" badges. And the Kennedys had brought in a couple of beautiful, beautiful girls to be hospitality people, handing out literature and pins and whatever. So, and of course, the ball players like that
lines
too.
From generation to generation.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Let's go to Chad. Chad, your first experience being a fan.
I think it might have been just listening to the Twins on the radio when I was very, very young. My dad was a fan, so we would listen on the radio. I don't remember the first time I saw him on TV, but there was no other team to root for other than the Twins at that point. I was born in Minnesota. I watched all the teams. I was a Twins fan from day one.
Good. And then, do you remember when they were with Washington, and do you remember the excitement that preceded their move to Minnesota?
I was too young for that. I wasn't born until 1971, so they were already here for 10 years.
Ah, okay.
What are you doing on this old man show? You should be on the old man show. You're a kid.
He's bringing on demographics.
He's a youngster. He's a youngster. That's right. You know what, Ralph, one thing, when you mentioned about loyalties, I know my loyalty had to be a little bit split because when the expansion senators were there, obviously I was rooting for them and followed them. Then when my dad went to the Twins in '68, now I'm following both the Twins and the expansion senators. And then
they play each other, and they would play.
Yeah,
each
they
other.
did.
What was
they
that
did
like
play
the first
each
time
other.
Minnesota came back to Washington?
Yeah, well, I think Washington swept them, as a matter of fact. What I remember, and all the fans in Washington were so excited because here's the new kids on the block beating the old kids on the block.
Wow. I still say that.
George, could I ask you could I ask George a question, please?
Sure, Chad. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
George, what was the ownership like when your dad played? I mean, what kind of relationship did the ownership have with the players?
Well, that was Calvin Griffith, Chad, and I really can't speak for the other players, but when my dad was offered the job, Cal Irmer was a friend, and Calvin, I believe, called my dad up because Calvin and my dad knew one another for many years in Washington, and Calvin told my father that he was bringing my dad on along with Early Wynn, and that he would really want my father to be there with Early because he knew that my dad and Early were good friends. So I would have to say, from my point of view, Calvin Griffith was very instrumental in my dad going to Minnesota. Now I don't know what about the year after because Cal Irmer was let go and Billy Martin was brought in. So I don't know whose decision that was, but I do know that my dad, when he went to Minnesota, probably would not have gone to Minnesota if it hadn't been for Calvin. And I think it was Calvin who probably personally asked my dad, to join the ball club.
Well, was it like that when he was a ball player too?
Well, my dad's mostly had his relationship with Calvin's father, Clark Griffith. When Clark Griffith died in '55, Calvin took over. So, my dad knew him from the time that Calvin was there. Matter of fact, I think Calvin at one point was a bat boy for the Senators. I'm not sure what year it was, but my dad's relationship with Clark Griffith was a lot deeper and a lot longer than it was with Calvin, although certainly, knew one another and were friends. But with Clark Griffith, my dad loved Clark Griffith because they went back a long time together.
Was that typical of a lot of ball players in those days?
I think probably. Well, I think maybe it was. I think there was a different relationship because, the players, Chad, a little bit different than today. I mean, back then the players actually negotiated their contracts every year with either the owner or the general manager. There were no agents involved. There were no long-term contracts involved. So there was based on a personal relationship. And if a player had a good year, he would be rewarded. If he had a good year, and I know one time it happened with my dad was holding out for a small raise, and Mr. Griffith said to him, George, I'm going to give you the raise, but, if we don't make it up at the gate at the end of the year, I expect you to return the money. So
really,
it's a little bit different than today, but that's the way it was done back then. And nobody thought anything differently. I know my dad, and I'll tell you what the amount was. The amount was $500. My dad didn't want to sign his contract. He sent it back to Mr. Griffith and said, Mr. Griffith, here's my contract unsigned. I'm really looking for a $500 raise. I think he led the league in stolen bases for the fifth year and hit like 290 or something like that. He had a good year. And, Mr. Griffith wanted him in, obviously in the fold, but, I have the letter. And he said, George, here's your new contract with your demand, but, if we don't make it up at the gate, I'm going to ask you for the money back. That's how important money was to, Clark Griffith and the Washington Ball Club during those years.
And, a similar story. George told me that story, which I put in the book. But one of the perhaps more well-known stories was that the year after Mickey Mantle in 1956 won the Triple Crown, he didn't repeat in '57, and George Weiss, the Yankee general manager, tried to cut his salary.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
I think that's what it was, and that's where a lot of the players, and what David is talking about, a lot of the players during those eras, even Mickey Mantle, as great as he was, they signed one-year contracts.
Yep.
And
was there anyone that signed a two-year contract, and when? I
think there might have been a few, like maybe DiMaggio or Babe Ruth or Gehrig. That I think probably, but for the most part, just about every player. And I have all the contracts. The player's contract was based upon the performance a year before. And in the case of Washington, again, the player could have had a good year, but the gate at Griffith Stadium could have been down. So, my dad couldn't get a raise because Mr. Griffith didn't make any money.
And, of course, they had no other choice.
Right, and that's also one of the reasons, if you look back in the history of it, why Connie Mack sold the four great players that he had: Cochran, Simmons, Lefty Grove, and
Fox,
Jimmy Fox. Yeah, because the fact that he had to pay his bills, And the only way he was going to pay his bills was going to be able to sell or trade those players. And I think each one of those players, received like $100,000. The A's received like something in $100,000 or whatever when they sold or traded. And then even in Washington, if you look back, Washington, Clark Griffith sold his son-in-law, who they just won the American League pennant in 33. In 34, he sold his son-in-law, Joe Cronin, to the Boston Red Sox for $225,000 plus Lynn Larry. Now, who knows who Lynn Larry was? But certainly $225,000 into the coffers of Clark Griffith was huge.
And that was the same reason that the Red Sox sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees. They needed the money.
to pay. What was it? To pay for the Broadway play or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was producing.
No,
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
But the players were stuck. I mean, they either took it or they were not playing for the year.
Absolutely.
Right.
There was no reserve clause. There was no anything. I mean, you don't, and if you didn't play, or you didn't sign your contract, that's why a lot of times they would have a holdout, and the holdout would go maybe till the first week or first day of spring training, and then the player would sign. But the players were signing 1 year. There was no such thing as a long-term contract. None. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, but that was the extent of it. Even the superstars.
David and George, what was attendance like during the war? And I'm including you, David, because you wrote a book about it.
Yeah, well, the attendance, I think, was, not that much during the war. I know in Washington, as a matter of fact, I think the only year I saw a number, and I think that was in 46, so it was a year after the war, they drew over 1 million fans in Washington. But other than that, I think they were around maybe 500, 600, 700,000 a year.
Well, I don't even think it was that high, but
it might not have
interesting.
been.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Washington did very well compared to the other 7 teams in the league. The Senators was third, maybe fourth, no lower than fourth in terms of attendance. And a lot of that was because Griffith was able to take advantage of all of the servicemen that were in Washington who were working for what was then the War Department or the State Department, or were serving in the military, and had the opportunity to go to baseball games because Griffith played brought in a lot of night games. And twinighters and double headers, which we've talked about. So the attendance was good, and then of course he got rentals from not only the Redskins but also from the Homestead Grays for Griffith Stadium. So he did quite well. When I say quite well, I mean it's comparative. But
no, it is comparative, David, and you're absolutely right. I mean, like we said before, his income was generated by Griffith Stadium, the Senators, Homestead Grays, Redskins. That's what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, and what probably a lot of people do know as well, but in 1945, the Senators had to finish the season a week early because Mr. Griffith had already arranged to lease out Griffith Stadium to the Washington Redskins for football.
Yeah, and as a result, the Senators had to double up on double headers to leave that week free, and a number of the players felt that they would have won the pennant that year, but the pitching staff was just blown out by the time they got.
Yeah.
That's what the end. They finished second in 45.
Yeah,
and,
they did by
it. Got 2 games. I think it was a game. Yep.
But they ended up playing all the games.
Oh yeah, they had to finish. Yeah, they played all the games, but they
played all the games.
But I think if I remember correctly, that season, and David, you might know exactly, but I think something like 1945, the Senators played 44 doubleheaders that year.
Oh my
44.
Yeah, because you know what happened.
Today, you never even see a doubleheader. I mean, unless it's a rain out or something like that. But back then, that was part of the regular season schedule for the Senators in 1945, 44 doubleheaders. And what David is saying, in order to make up the fact that they gave the last week of the season, and they didn't think, because the year before they finished in last, so nobody thought that the Senators.
That's right.
That's
right.
So here they are, and my dad, I remember him telling me, here they are sitting in the clubhouse at Griffith Stadium listening to the radio. And when Hank Greenberg hit the 9th inning grand slam home run to beat the St. Louis Browns, and ensure the pennant for the Tigers. If he hadn't hit that and they played a doubleheader, if Washington had been in contention and the Detroit had lost both games of that doubleheader, Washington was going to get on a train, go to Detroit for a one-game playoff. That's how close this.
Yeah. Wow. They had in 44 they were 64 and 90. In 45 they were 87 and 67. So they went from last place to second, and they looked. Right. And Griffith had signed his contract with the Redskins. I'm not sure if it was before the season or somewhere during the season, but he knew well in advance that they had to make this change. So it wasn't just the last week. They were playing doubleheaders,
Yeah, no, they were
throughout the month.
I remember my dad telling me. He said, here we are. We're a major league ball club. We have no place to play.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that last week of the season, they didn't play at all?
No, they played.
Oh.
No, they didn't play at home. They played whatever games they had.
Right.
But no, there were no home games. It was just.
Oh my God, that poor pitching staff! They must have been blown out.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly, they were. They were
overworked because you don't have what you have today, where you have pitch counts and everything else. I mean, they had starters, and those starters were pitching 9 innings, and then the next starter would pitch the second game of a doubleheader, and then the next day they had the second game, another doubleheader, and next game. I mean, that's the way it was. If you ever look at retro sheet, you'll be amazed to see the number of doubleheaders that David was talking about in the last, last 7 weeks, the last 7 days of the season. Just about every game was a doubleheader.
And as a final footnote to that, when we were talking about making money, there was a single admission for all these games. Right. So they lost money on the doubleheader. It wasn't like a
day-night doubleheader.
No, there was no such thing. You went in at 12 o'clock noon, and you sat there till 8 o'clock at night, enjoying a great day of baseball. But for Griffith,
and nobody ever said speed it up. Nobody was in any hurry to leave.
Right.
Yeah, but they only took about 2 hours.
Right. As David will say, if you look back at the numbers, you're going to see ball games that were played, 2.5, 3 hours maximum. I mean, today, what was it, last week in one of those series games?
5 hours.
The ball game went 5 hours and something.
It was over 5 hours.
Right.
Yeah, but that was a World Series game, so you got to give those games a little leeway, obviously.
Well, you do, but all the pitching changes and all the commercial breaks and all that stuff. I mean, in the old days, I can tell you, you never had that because there weren't any such thing as commercial breaks. I mean, the game was played. Period. That was it.
Hey guys, I have a question. Was the farm system, not just on the Senators, but on all teams in baseball, in effect during the war? And when all these double headers were going on, I guess if the answer is no to that, then this question is silly. But were players being called up from the minors? Your retro sheets could probably show to replace pitchers who were down or just pitched too many innings? Did they have the flow of new players coming in?
Well, I think, I'm going to let other people answer that, but as far as Washington, I think, they did. They brought up players. But the players were, so-called replacement players, whatever. They didn't have the skill level that the major leaguers did. And that's why you'll see a lot of the people will say, well, wartime baseball was a lot, the quality of play. And it's true. I mean, it certainly fell off. But I know in Washington's case, I remember my dad talking about this, and I've read it in a book. They brought up a young fella from some minor league club. He had been a raw rookie. He gets out on the mound, and believe it or not, he's playing in, whatever he's pitching in the last couple innings of a ball game. He takes his hat off and puts his hat next to the mound, and the umpire says, "Hey, son, you can't do that." And the guy says, "Well, this is the way I always pitch." He said, "Well, son, you're in the major leagues now. You got to have your hat on." So that's how crazy it was. But
they brought up some very unusual ball plays during. I guess it was when they brought up. Losing my mind too. When they what's his name had the wooden leg. We talked about him so often.
Bert Shepard.
Bert Shepard, right. Bert Shepard got into one game. I think it was against the Red Sox, but
yes, it was.
But before Shepard came into the game, and he actually finished out the game, they had brought up a pitcher, I think he was from Ireland, who had never pitched before in the major leagues like somebody of the other, and he was just horrendously bad. I mean, just terrible. And as a result, he never pitched another inning in Major League Baseball, and neither did Bert Shepard. So that's a great trivia question because the two of them appeared on the same mound on the same day, and neither one of them ever pitched again in the Major Leagues.
Well, you know what, David, that's amazing, and I can tell you, I mean, I knew, I'd never met him that I remember. I probably did as a kid, but I've got, autographed balls with Bert Shepard, and I've got pictures of Bert Shepard. I remember my dad talking about it. I mean, Bert Shepard had his leg shot off during World War II. He was a fighter pilot, and he was downed over Germany. The German doctors, they operated on him. The fact is that he got back into major leagues because he was going to Washington, told Mr. Griffith, I'd like to have a shot. And he was at Walter Reed Hospital, and Mr. Griffith said, sure, come on out. And he thought it'd be good with the veterans. And that's what Bert Shepard did. He did a lot of speaking at Walter Reed, talking to World War II veterans. But he actually did get in a major league game. He did quite well, as a matter of fact. He did, I think he pitched 3 in some innings and did well. And my dad said, because he and Bert were good friends, he said, Bert was amazing, the fact that he could pitch on his wooden leg. The downside of that was that, and the same thing happened with Monty Stratton, a pitcher with a wooden leg cannot get off the mound quick enough. So, the way they would combat that, players would bunt or whatever because they knew that was going to be his weakness. But my dad said he was just an incredible athlete, and the fact that he did so well. And another one later on, pitched for the A's, was Lou Brissy. Same thing with Lou Brissy. He overcame a lot of World War II injuries to actually pitch and do quite well in the major leagues.
Yeah, and he had Bert had a good promoter who turned out to be the Secretary of State, who had met him back at Walter Reed. Right. And he was so impressed by his determination to get into the major leagues that he recommended that Griffith go see him, and that's yeah.
And they were originally going to use him as a batting practice pitcher. Ozzie
and they did.
And Ozzie said, Bert, I want you to throw batting practice and whatever. And then Ozzie became, so impressed by Bert that he put him in that game against the Red Sox, and he did quite well.
Yeah, I think he even got ahead, if I'm not mistaken. And what's interesting too about that story is that he said he could pitch because the leg that had been amputated was not the leg he landed on. So he was able to land on his good leg and was able to field that way. And another interesting sideline, before the season began, while he was still sort of trying out, during the war, the Senators had spring training at the University of Maryland because the teams were not allowed to go south. So at one point, when he was still unsigned, the Yankees sent a plane for him to come to New York and try out with the Yankees. And at that point, when that became publicly known, Griffith was not too, he didn't react as strongly or as publicly as did the Negro press. The African-American press was beside itself when they found out because they had been trying to get some of their top ball players into the major leagues, and here was the major league, 2 teams vying for a pitcher with one leg. So they took that as an indication that, hey, we're not wanted in the major league, but we're really not wanted if they're going to go after a pitcher with one leg, because they had some really good, pitchers.
They sure did.
Yeah, who could easily.
I hadn't heard that, David. I'm glad you related that. I can understand it. I had not heard that, but I do know that the Yankees and the Senators were both vying for Bert Shepard. And,
Yeah.
You know, so I know that part of it. I did not know the Negro League part of it, but that's really interesting because again, with Ronnie on there, I mean, Ronnie, that's before Jackie Robinson. So
yes,
I mean,
it is.
That's the way it was. Yep.
What year was that about? 45?
That would have been 45, right?
Yeah. That's
George, did the Homestead Grays played in the same ballpark? Did the ball players befriend each other?
No, I think they did. I'm not sure because I've never heard my dad really talk about it, but I think that they must have. I'm not sure they ever played against one another, but they shared the locker room, they shared the dugout, and they would probably see each other. Although, you know, when they were playing, the Grays were playing at Griffith Stadium when the Washington Ball Club was on the road, and then vice versa.
Yeah, that's true.
When the Ball Club was home, the Grays would be playing in Pittsburgh. So, I mean, but I think that certainly they knew him, and I know, you know, with Cool Papa Bell and Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard and all those great Negro League players, certainly the Washington players, and again, we've talked about this before. Mr. Griffith, you know, could have signed probably some of those great players, but he knew that if he did, it was going to affect the gate for the Homestead Grays because the fans were coming out many times. You know, the attendance was greater to watch the Grays than it was to watch the Senators.
Yes.
Really?
Was it accepted that the blacks, Negroes in those days, Negro Leaguers, were on a pretty close level with major leagues?
I think it was the great players, yes.
Especially those who saw them play.
Right, some of those barnstorming trips when Bob Feller and the All-Stars were playing the Negro League All-Stars and Satchel and that, you know, the Negro League All-Stars were doing extremely well. So there were players on the Negro Leagues, certainly, you know, Josh Gibson and Leonard and Cool Papa Bell, you know, those guys were Major League caliber players. And, you know, they didn't play because the fact of the time and the Negro League was flourishing. But, you know, once Jackie signed and then Dobie, I mean, all of a sudden, you know, you look at the Negro League and a couple of years later, you know, they folded because all their great stars were going into the major leagues.
Yeah, and that's what Griffith saw.
Not to the Yankees, and that brings me to a former Minnesota Twin who did very well with Minnesota, did well with Cleveland, super fielder, and was held back those many years by your Yankees, Mr. Hubler.
Yes.
And that was Vic Power.
Oh, yeah.
Power.
Yeah. Powell played with the A's for a good number of years, if I remember correctly.
Many years, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another one. And he wasn't just a first baseman. If I remember correctly, he was kind of a utility guy as well. He could play second base.
Oh, really? I thought he was mainly a first baseman.
Mainly first, but back in the day, he played a little second base as well, especially for the A's.
Yeah, great.
Very sad with the Yankees. First black was Elston Howard. That wasn't until 1956.
That wasn't a bad choice, by the way. I mean, I know the Yankees dragged their heel. You know,
They were one of the last teams.
Yes, but the Red Sox were the last, and that's always given me a moment
the Red Sox were the last team, right?
Yeah, and they also, as we've talked about, and I pointed out in a couple of public speaking engagements, they had a tryout with Jackie Robinson.
The Red Sox did.
The Red Sox.
Willie Mays might have tried out for them.
No, it was Jackie Robinson. He went up there, and it was a political stunt within Boston. A couple of the local politicians there, in what I guess was the equivalent of Tammany Hall up there, decided that it would look good if they had tryouts for some of the Negro League players. So they had Jackie Robinson, and I forget there were two other ball players. Who came, one of whom actually also made the major leagues. And if I had time, I'd look it up. But anyway, they went up there, and in fact, it was the very weekend that Roosevelt died. So it was like April of 1945, and they went up there and they went through the motions of trying out. There were no active ball players from the Red Sox. The manager wasn't there. The coaches weren't there. There was, I think, one or two officials from the Red Sox. As far as you can tell, they said
there, and
who?
Higgins. Joe Cronin?
Not at the. I don't believe at the tryout.
Okay.
But anyway, because they said they did that, they went through the motions, and they didn't get so much as a thank you when they finished, and they never heard from the Red Sox. They never heard from them.
Okay, isn't that something? Unbelievable.
No, I have a little trivia question, David and Ralph and Ronnie and Chad. The first black battery for the New York Yankees was who and when?
Al Downing from Trenton, New Jersey.
Right.
And Elston Howard.
Howard.
Right, and it was 1961.
That was a big year for the Yankees.
And the reason I know that specifically, that was Al Downing's Major League debut. It was at Griffith Stadium against the expansive Senators when my dad was the third base coach. And Al and my dad were very friendly. And, of course, I knew Al and played against him. But that was Al's Major League debut in 1961. And that was the first black battery for the Yankees. Elston Howard as the catcher and Al Downing as the pitcher. And it was 1961.
And then Al Downing had another famous trivia moment, didn't he?
He sure did. He sure did. When Hank Aaron, and I've told a lot of people this, though, Al handled that with great class. He was a real gentleman, very classy person, and he and Hank Aaron made a lot of appearances together. You know, Hank Aaron hit number 715 off of Al Downing in Atlanta,
right.
And that's what happened. But as Al used to say, he said, "Hey, somebody was. I mean, Hank was going to hit 715 off of somebody. It just happened to be me."
Right. That's right.
And they both wore number 44.
Yes, they did.
That's right. Yeah.
Something. Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
I remember that. I remember that game. I watched it. It was just incredible.
I think they put on the scoreboard, I think if I remember seeing it, move over, babe, here comes Henry.
Yep.
And
right.
Standing there to greet him was Dusty Baker. And this brings us to the present a little bit. The current Washington Nationals, as is their privilege, decided not to extend Dusty Baker. But what really...
I thought was a terrible decision.
The way they did it. Did we talk about this last week? The way they did it was absolutely horrible.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, it was not nice.
Can't
but
remind
Bob Nightingale from the USA Today just wrote a blistering article about the Nationals, how bad they treated him and how they did this. It was really a chippy thing. Terrible.
Yeah.
And he really blasted them. Yeah.
And, the Yankees...
Okay, guys, we're finally going to get around to it, the Cuban connection.
Okay.
I'm going to start with you, David. How did that come about initially?
George can help me out on this, too, a great deal. Griffith had a scout in Cuba. Remember, I forget his name right now, who was sending ball players up to Griffith. Now, what's interesting is that and he had as many as 5 on the roster during the war.
Right. That scout was Joe Cambria.
Yeah, that's right, Joe Cambria.
Right.
And the interesting thing was that their skin tone was from like chocolate to dark black.
Right.
But because they spoke Spanish, they were not considered American Negroes. So they were able to play with the Senator/Nationals at the time. And some of them were fairly good. Roberto Ortiz was one of the ball players who was quite good with them. And one of the interesting things was that they would get this special visa to come up and play. Mike Guerra, who was their backup catcher for a couple of seasons,
right,
was one of the others. When they, and I've mentioned this too before, that St. Louis was a terribly racist city at the time.
It was.
And And the players, the Washington Cuban players were treated terribly. I mean, there was just constant baiting and fight. There were a couple of fights broke out.
Sure.
So one of the things that was kind of interesting, in 1944, the war, I think it was called the War Management Board, decided for some reason, whatever the reason was, that players who could avoid the draft by getting this deferment no longer got the deferment. This is like in the middle of the season. And so the Cuban contingent actually decided, well, I'm not going to say, we're not going to go fight the war. We're going back to Cuba. That was their only choice. They could go back to Cuba. And they did. Some of them started out to go back. A number of them actually made it back to Cuba. And I guess Griffith, I never really found any factual proof of this, but Griffith must have, because one of his buddies was General Louis B. Hershey, the head of Selective Service System. And as I've said before, they used to have lunch together. And I think Griffith somehow got to Hershey, who somehow got to the War Management Board, and they reversed that decision. So then the Cubans managed to all come back. In fact, one of them had this horrendous trip trying to get back to Washington because the trains were taken by troop movements, and the aircraft flying was not all that common as it is today, and flights fewer flights. And so it took him days, literally, to get back, not from Havana to Miami, but from Miami to Washington. And he finally made it back.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting.
I wanted to mention one thing about when David mentioned, Joe Cambria. Joe Cambria, and that's where the so-called Cuban connection, but Joe Cambria also signed a lot of American players. He signed my dad. He signed Mickey Vernon, Early Wynn, Gil Cohn, many, many American-born players. But with Chad and Ronnie on the line, the one player, and David talked about some great Cuban players. They had Ramos and Pascual, but I believe the great Tony Oliva was signed by Joe Cambria. Joe Cambria had a nickname called Papa Joe, and that's what the Cuban players referred to him. And I believe that Tony Oliva was signed by Joe Cambria.
By Joe?
And I do believe that Tony Oliva's real name was, it escapes me. It wasn't Tony. His brother's name was Tony. And he came over on his brother's visa or passport. And his real name was
Ronnie, I think you mentioned the name. I can't remember his name either. But But that's the story that I heard about Tony, and of course he was one of the greatest players, and maybe one of these days he's going to get into the Hall of Fame because I think he's deserving of it. It's just that he's had such a relatively short career because he had bad knees, and that's what held him back.
Scout, and not just him, but there are a number of scouts out there that deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. No scouts are in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
Here's one, George Genovese, who signed a bunch of players for the Giants, recently passed away, lived to be an old man. He's not in the Hall of Fame, and I think a case can be made for if he put Bowie Kuhn in the Hall of Fame and Bud Selig, then you should put the scouts in.
Ralph, that's a very good point because scouts are tremendous in what they do, but they are really, very much underappreciated. Nobody knows who they are. A lot of them are former ball players who really know talent, but they're, within the organization. Yeah, within their organization, they really don't get any publicity. I mean, the fact is that the general managers or the commissioners of the league or the presidents or whatever, they get all the press, but scouts don't get any. But yet scouts, without scouts, Major League Baseball would not have the great players that they have.
But I just wanted to add another note on that story about the Cuban ball players because I'd mentioned Mike Guerra and Roberto Ortiz. There were four of them actually. Gil Torres was a third, and the fourth one, some some of us may also remember the fourth one was a rookie shortstop by the name of Preston Gomez. Preston Gomez had a remember? Preston Gomez had a nice major league career later on.
Right.
He was a coach for the Dodgers too.
Yep.
He was. Right.
They were given 10 days to either register for the draft or go back to Cuba. And they did. And I'm looking at the page right now, and I did write that Louis Hershey was was instrumental in getting the rule changed again. So
were any of the Cubans, did they go into the draft? Did they all go back?
No.
Or did any of them?
Guerra and Ortiz immediately packed and left. And interesting little side note about Guerra. The book I wrote, The Nats and the Grays, started out as a novel. And I got in touch with some of the ball players who at that time were still alive. I tried to reach Mike Guerra. He was living in Miami by then. And I didn't get any response to my query, but I sent a second query, and several months later I got a note from Mrs. Guerra that Mike had died. He had died of cancer, and but he knew of my request, and she said that he was so surprised that anyone remembered him playing Major League Baseball. It made him so happy. And I still have the note. I mean, it was just a very touching kind of thing for me to get that kind of note. Yeah.
Well, he was, and David, I happen to have a picture. I have a photograph of one of the Washington Senators teams. I'm not sure which year it was, maybe 45, but Mike Guerra is in the photograph. I mean, I knew him immediately because I recognized his face, but he was one of three catchers that the Washington Ball Club had because they had 4 knuckleball pitchers on the starting staff. And so they had Jake Early, they had Al Evans, and they had Mike Guerra. They had 3 catchers to catch the knuckleballers.
And they brought Early back in 44. I forget who. I think he was with the Browns, or he'd been traded to the Browns. They brought him back specifically because of the knuckleball pitchers.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, hey,
let me ask David and George: were the Nationals the first team to bring in Cuban ball players?
That's a very good question, Chad. I really, I can't answer that. I don't know.
Sure. I wouldn't be surprised, though. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, I know that.
They were one of the first, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know the Cuban connection, and that's always been associated with Washington, but I can't tell you about the other ball clubs. I really don't know.
Yeah.
Well, not
Ralph,
policymakers deciding to let certain humans in the big leagues with the same color of skin and omit other humans from being in the big leagues because the same color skin and the ones that they're bringing in are from other countries.
Right.
And the ones that they're omitting from our own country.
Yeah.
This is some craziness.
Ralph, listen, before we end, because I see we're getting close to end, I just wanted to point out, and I think most of us will agree, we should say a word or two about Ray Robinson, the great baseball writer who passed away this week at about, I think he was 95 or 98, somewhere like that, and who wrote some great biographies of ball players, including what's his name? The great Giants pitcher. He wrote some really wonderful.
Christy Mathewson, I think.
Yeah, Christy Mathewson. Right. So he passed away this week.
Yeah, I remember reading about that on Facebook, and there was a very nice tribute. I think it was Marty Appel wrote a very nice tribute about Ray Robinson, who certainly was a well-respected and well-known writer. And who did, David is absolutely right. I think it was just last week that he passed away, and he was in his late 90s.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Well, David, you're a Yankee fan, and Ray Robinson combined with a fellow by the name of Christopher Jennison to put together a book called Pennants and Pinstripes, the New York Yankees from 1903 to 2002. And it contains some of the most beautiful, rare pictures of any, and I collect a lot of baseball books. This is right up there. Ray Robinson wrote the text for the book, and it's terrific. So rest in peace. Before we go, I want to get more in the habit of using podcast radio as selfless self-promotion. So I want to talk to David first. I know your book's been out a while, but it can still be obtained. Tell me how, David.
Okay. The title is The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield. It's now available in paperback, although I'm sure you could buy the hardback if you wanted. It's available simply, you can go on Amazon, go on barnesandnoble.com. You can walk into your local bookstore and order it. The paperback, I believe, is just about $25. It contains a lot of photos of these old-time Senators and Homestead Grays ball players. And the Minnesota Twins were extremely gracious in allowing me to use their photos. They have a wonderful collection of the old Senators because that was their genesis. And I find, I must say, one of the things I found so fascinating was so much of the book is devoted to the wartime era itself and how many really unusual things happened during that era on the ball fields and off the ball fields. People say that baseball was nothing during the war. Well, it really wasn't nothing. It was quite interesting, and as we've even talk today about that. So the Nats and the Grays. That'll get you the book.
Great.
Thank you.
And now, George, you have an excellent DV set that you compiled. Tell us about that and how it can be obtained.
Okay, well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate David. He and I have worked, the last couple of years. I supplied him with a lot of information, and he was very gracious in his comments to me, and I'm very happy about his book doing so well because it certainly hit home for me, World War II era Major League Baseball, especially in Washington. Now, I have a website. It's www.timelessbaseball.com. which is all about World War II era baseball, photographs, blogs, information on our DVD, which is called Ball Field, the Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK. It's all in color. It was 8mm color home movies that were taken by my dad and Mickey Vernon, and both of them supplied the narration, and it's been extremely well received. I've sold many DVDs over the years, and now we're offering a special for between now and Christmas of $19.95 for the 60-minute DVD, which is regular price $29.95. And anybody who buys it, all they have to do is let me know, and I will, send them a refund check for the $10. So it is a special promotion for the DVD, and I'm thrilled to do it because my historical background is really World War II baseball, and I feel that I am pretty privileged to have been the son of a former player who played during that era, and I have quite a bit of knowledge that I'd like to share with baseball fans.
Beautiful.
Great. That's wonderful.
You can imagine how I'm just bursting with pride to have you guys both, all four of you. Welcome back, Chad. Ronnie, ongoing.
Yep.
You're terrific. And
thank you.
George and David, again, thank you. We will come back, same time, same bat channel, as Al Blumkin says, and we'll be back next week.
Yep. Well, look forward to it. Bye, everybody.
It's always a pleasure.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm
Chad,
glad you guys
back.
are having fun. Again, Chad, welcome back. We love you here.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Ronnie, be well, and we'll see you all next week.
Right.
Adios, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.